We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Amud Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 30a. This daf is sponsored by Moshe Feinstein in memory of his mother, Lisa Bas Esther. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amud or a daf, see the description box below, and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amud, the Mishnah brought a machlokes tanoim. The Mishnah was discussing the idea that when it comes to pigul, which is when the Kohen offers the carbon during the blood avodos, that's during the avodah of shchita, or during the avodah of the kabbalas hadam, the receiving of the blood, or by the holacha, the conveying of the blood, or the zrika, the throwing of the blood, in any of those points in time, if the Kohen has in mind chutz lizmano, he has a machshava, he has an intention that the carbon will be consumed outside of the proper time, so then we say the carbon is pigul, and if somebody eats from that carbon, they are chayiv kares. That's the basic halacha of machshavas chutz lizmano, the basic halacha of pigul. And the Mishnah mentioned that if there is another machshava, another disqualifying machshava, for example, let's say the Kohen would also have a machshava of chutz lemekomo, so then we say that the carbon is in fact pasul, but it is not a situation of pigul. Rather, it is a case where the carbon is pasul, but there is no pigul, there is no chiyuv kares, no liability to kares when you eat from that carbon. But there was a machlokas tanoim in the Mishnah. What would happen if the machshavas pigul, if that comes first, and then comes the other disqualifying intention? And so, for example, let's say during the shchita, there would be a machshava that would be chutz lizmano, and then after that, let's say during the kabbalah, during the holacha, there's a machshava of chutz lemekomo. So there, do we say that it's considered pigul, or we say no, that's also a situation where both machshavas mix together, and we say there's no chiyuv kares, it's not considered to be pigul. The Rabbanan say it doesn't make any difference whether the machshava of chutz lemekomo happens before or after. We always say that the fact that there's another disqualifying intention, that means that it is not pigul. But Rabbi Yehuda says no, it does make a difference. And if the machshava of chutz lemekomo, if that happens after the machshava of chutz lizmano, so then in fact it is pigul. And we had a machlokas on the previous Amud within the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. What was Rabbi Yehuda talking about? Is Rabbi Yehuda saying only in a situation where it's two avodos? So let's say in the earlier avoda there's a machshavas chutz lizmano, and then in a subsequent avoda there's a machshavas chutz lemekomo. Only over there Rabbi Yehuda says that it remains pigul. But let's say it would be in the same avoda within the shchita, within the kabbalas hadam. You first have a machshava of chutz lizmano and then chutz lemekomo. So there, really, the machshavos, they would mix together. That's the opinion of Ilfa. Ilfa says again that the machlokes is only in a situation of shtei avodos, but not by one avoda. But Rabbi Yochanan says no, the machlokes is all the time. And so even if it would be within one avoda, Rabbi Yehuda says that if the machshava of chutz lizmano comes first and then the machshava of chutz lemekomo, Rabbi Yehuda would still say that it is considered to be pigul. And the Gemara asked on the previous Amud, according to Rabbi Yochanan, so the Mishnah then would be switching tracks, because the Mishnah in the beginning of the Mishnah clearly was talking about two avodos, and then we're going to have to say that the Mishnah then moves to one avoda, and that's why there's a machlokas tanoim even in a situation of one avoda. That's how we're going to have to learn according to Rabbi Yochanan. That's a little difficult to say that the Mishnah is switching from two avodos to one avoda, but the Gemara says yes, that's exactly what Rabbi Yochanan will say. Reisha b'shtei avodos, the beginning of the Mishnah is talking about two avodos, and Seifa, the end of the Mishnah, is bein ba'avoda achas, bein b'shtei avodos. That can be talking about one avoda or two avodos, meaning the machlokas is in all of these situations, all of these scenarios. Rashi explains yes, reisha b'shtei avodos. The beginning of the Mishnah is by two avodos to hamafarish behedya. That's clear. That's explained explicitly in the Mishnah that the beginning of the Mishnah is talking about shtei avodos. And Seifa, but the end of the Mishnah, iklu ukma de betar vayu pligi. You can say that the machlokas is by both. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Omer Rabbi Yehuda says, Zeh haklal, this is the rule. In machsheves hazman kidmo lemachsheves hamokum, if the machsheves hazman, the intention for the wrong time, preceded the machshava, the intention for the wrong mokum, the wrong place, so then pigul v'chayav and all of kares, then it still is pigul, and there's a liability to kares. And the Gemara says, Bishlam Rabbi Yochanan. Now it makes sense according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says the machlokas is both by shtei avodos and avoda achas. Hainu dekatani zeh haklal. That's why it says Zeh haklal. Zeh haklal is generally an inclusion, where Rabbi Yehuda is saying even in the situation of one avoda. Elo le'ilfa, but according to Ilfa, my Zeh haklal, what's the point of saying Zeh haklal in the Mishnah? And the Gemara says kasha, the Gemara leaves that as a difficulty. Rashi explains, Hainu dekatani Zeh haklal le'isuye avoda achas. The Zeh haklal is an inclusion, it comes to include avoda achas. That would make sense again according to Rabbi Yochanan. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Tanan Hasam, we learned in a Mishnah over there, Harezu Tmuras Ola Tmuras Shlamim. Let's say a person says, this is Tmuras Ola and this is Tmuras Shlamim. This is from Meseches Tmura. And what's being discussed over here is, there's a halacha that a person has a carbon. Let's say a person has a carbon that's a carbon Ola. So the person is not allowed to say that this animal is going to be in exchange for that carbon Ola. It's going to be a substitute for that animal. That I'm going to substitute one animal for another. And what ends up happening is if the person does say that, and then both animals become carbon Ola. That's the general halacha of Tmura. And so the Mishnah over here is discussing, what if a person says, Harezu Tmuras Ola Tmuras Shlamim? He makes both statements. He says, this animal is Tmuras Ola and it's Tmuras Shlamim. What would happen in that situation? Rashi explains, Tanan Hasam we learned over there in the Mishnah of Meseches Tmura. This is a Mishnah in Tmura. Harezu Tmuras Ola Tmuras Shlamim. This animal is Tmuras Ola and Tmuras Shlamim. Shehemid Bemas Chulin Eitzel Shtayim. What he does is, he stands up an animal that's chulin, it's not a carbon, and he stands it up next to two other animals. Achas Ola v'achas Shlamim. Now one of those animals is a carbon Ola and one's a carbon Shlamim. And he says, Harezu Tmuras Ola Tmuras Shlamim. He says, this animal is going to be Tmuras Ola Tmuras Shlamim. So what happens in that situation? The Mishnah continues, Harezu Tmuras Ola Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says that this new animal, this Behemas Chulin, it takes on the status of a Tmuras Ola. We follow the first thing that he said. Rashi explains, Harezu Tmuras Ola, this is Tmuras Ola. Tefos Lashon Rishon, we follow the Lashon Rishon, the first thing that he said. V'en Kedusha Chal al Kedusha, and holiness cannot be Chal, can't take effect on other holiness, so we follow what he said first. The first thing he said was Tmuras Ola to Tmuras Ola, and the Tmuras Shlamim does not take effect. And of course this is relevant to our Mishnah, because our Mishnah was dealing with the same basic idea. That's what Rabbi Yehuda essentially said. Rabbi Yehuda said that if first you have the Machshavas Chutz Lizmano, so then that takes effect, and the later Machshavas Chutz L'Makomo is not going to undo the pigul. That will be discussed as we go on. And the Mishnah continues, the Mishnah in Tmura, Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Im lekach niskavein tchila, if that's what he had in mind first, hoil v'yefsher lahotzi shtei shemos ka'acha, since it's impossible to say both at once, meaning if his actual intention was for both, Tmuras Ola and Tmuras Shlamim, but it's obviously impossible to say that all at once, so one of them is going to have to come out of his mouth first. So if that was his intention, so then devar of kayam, and then we say that what he said is fulfilled. We'll see in Rashi in a moment, but essentially seems to be saying that it's both Ola and Shlamim. V'im misha amar harezu Tmuras Ola. But let's say if when he says this is Tmuras Ola, so then what happens is nimlach v'yamar, then he changes his mind and he says harezu Tmuras Shlamim, this is Tmuras Shlamim. Basically, if it's a situation of changing his mind, so then harezu Ola. So then it's harezu Ola, or shinuye nuschos has harezu Tmuras Ola. Then it's going to be a situation of Tmuras Ola. Then we'll follow what he said first. But again, if he had both in mind, we would not say that. And Rashi explains, Hoel v'yefshel likros shtei shemos ka'achas. Rabbi Yossi says it's impossible to say both at once. V'hutzrech lahaktem zachar zeh. Obviously, he has to say one before the other. So then devar of kayam, and then Rabbi Yossi says what he says takes effect. Now, what do? It can't be both an Ola and a Shlamim. So what do? What you do is as follows: V'tira, the animal is allowed to be left to graze. And some put in the girsa again, the shinuye nuschos ad sheyistoiv. It's allowed to graze till it develops a mum, a blemish. V'timacher, and it's sold. V'yavi b'demei, and so then you'll bring with the money that you get from selling the animal chetzi ola, half the money will be used for an ola. V'demei chetzi shlamim, and half the money will be used for a shlamim. V'chein mafarish b'tmura, and that's how this is explained in Meseches Tmura. So that's the Mishnah, the Machlokas Tanaim in the Mishnah in Meseches Tmura. And the Gemara continues, they had the following question, Harezu Tmuras Ola Ushlamim. Let's say the way it's phrased is this is a Tmuras Ola Ushlamim, so he combines it all into one language. Mahu, what would be the halacha in that case? And Lachatzos Mahu, let's say he says it's Lachatzos, he's going to split it. Again, the animal is going to be both Ola Ushlamim. What would be the halacha in that situation? Rashi explains, Hachi Garsin, and the proper text is, Harezu Tmuras Ola Ushlamim Mahu. What if he says Tmuras Ola Ushlamim? Mi Amrinon, do we say, Had the polig Rabbi Meir. When Rabbi Meir argues v'amar tefos lashon rishon, he says that you follow what was said first. Again, that was in the case of the Mishnah. Harezu tmuras ola tmuras shlamim. There, Rabbi Meir says it's tmuras ola. Again, Rabbi Yossi says that in such a situation we say that they are both chal, unless it was a situation where he changed his mind. But Rabbi Meir says harezu tmuras ola tmuras shlamim. We say we follow what was said first. It's an ola. So therefore, in that situation, when Rabbi Meir said that tefos lashon rishon, misham da Amar Temuras Trezimne. Maybe that's only because he said the word Temuras 2 times. He said Arezu Temuras Ola, Temuras Shlamim, so it's like 2 separate statements, and we take the first one. V'havale Kenimlach, and essentially Rabbi Meir views that as if he changed his mind. Aval Hacha, but over here, De Amar Temuras Ola Ushlamim. Maybe if he says Temuras Ola Ushlamim, this is an exchange, a substitute for Ola and Shlamim, so then Chad Diburahu, so then it's Chad Dibura, then it's already one statement. You have a situation where it's all one statement. It's clear that that was the intention. Maybe Rabbi Meir would agree with Rabbi Yossi in that situation that Devar of Kayamin both would be Chal, V'tarvayu Chali, they both would be Chal. Odilma, or maybe Tefos Lashon Rishon Liola. Maybe Rabbi Meir is saying we always say Tefos Lashon Rishon. It doesn't really matter how it's said. If it said Harezu Tmuras Ola Shlamim, we would also say it's an Ola. Upashta Kedushas Ola Bekula, and the Kedusha, the holiness of Ola, spreads throughout the whole animal. Vesula also Shlamim V'chayli, and then the Kedusha of Shlamim cannot be Chal, it cannot take effect. And then the Gemara asked, Lachatzos Mahu, what if he says to split it? Im Timsa Lomar Pashta Kedushas Ola Bekula. If you're going to answer the first question and say, yes, the Kedushas Ola spreads in the whole thing. Amar Harei Behema Zu Lachatzos La'ola Shlamim. What if he specifies this animal is split to Ola and Shlamim? What would be the halacha? Hai Chad Diburahu, that's all one statement. Ve'in Zachal Below Zed, this will not take effect without the other. Odilma, or maybe again, Kavan de Pashta Bepalga Pashta Bekula, once the Ola spreads in half, it spreads in the whole animal. V'lo asu Shlamim V'chayli, and the Shlamim also there will not take effect. And the Gemara continues, Amar Abaya says, B'ha, in this case, Vadai Moder Rabbi Meir, when the statement is made in such a fashion that it's clear that his intention is both, so then Rabbi Meir would in fact admit, Rabbi Meir would say, like Rabbi Yossi, that Devar of Kayamin, that both are Chal. That's what Abaya says. In other words, according to Abaya, Rabbi Meir does not go to an extreme and always say Tefos Lashon Rishon. However, Rava says Adayin hi machlokas. It is still a machlokas, meaning according to Rava, Rabbi Meir in general, he always says Tefos Lashon Rishon. We take the phrase that was said first. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava li Abaya. Rava said to Abaya, L'didach, according to you, the Amrit B'havadai Moder Rabbi Meir, you say that in this case, again, if it's phrased in a fashion where both are clearly indicated as the person's intention, then Rabbi Meir admits to Rabbi Yossi. So we can ask the following question. Harei Shchita, what about the case of Shchita in our Mishnah? Our Mishnah has a case, Rashi explains, Varei Shchita, Tekatani Masnisin Lechol Kezayis Lamachar, Kezayis Bachutz. There's a case in our Mishnah where the person says, he has intention, again, the intention is to eat a kazayis from the animal l'machar tomorrow. So that intention, this is during the shchita, during that one avodah of shchita, he has intention first, chutz lizmano, to eat a kazayis l'machar, and then he has intention, kazayis b'chutz, to eat a kazayis outside of the proper place, all within shchita. So we take a look at that case. So according to what you're saying, that again, the Rabbi Meir always says tefos lashon rishon, so harei shchita de lechi lachatzos dami, the case of shchita really is similar to the case that we're asking by Tzmura of Lachatzos, where the person clearly says he wants to split the Kedusha, he wants the animal to be both Ola and Shlamim, Upligi, and yet we find that there is in fact a Machlokas Tanoim in our Mishnah about that issue. In other words, we do find the Machlokas Tanoim, and just like there's a Machlokas Tanoim in our Mishnah by a case of Shchita, so too there would be a Machlokas Tanoim in all situations, all scenarios here between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. Rashi explains, that the case of Shchita, you have those two intentions during the Shchita, that's like Lachatzos. What's the idea? The lav mahader imluche. The point is, there's no changing of the mind over here. That's not what's happening in our Mishnah, certainly. What's happening is he's having two separate intentions during the Shchita. First, he has an intention of Chutz Lizmano on a Kazayis, then he has an intention of Chutz L'Makom on a different Kazayis. Sharei Kama Zaysim Yesh Ba, there's several Zaysim, so to speak, there's many Kazaysim that are within this animal. So there's no issue here that he's changing his mind. So that's why it really is the same as the question that we're asking by Tzmura. V'chad dibur, it's one statement. Upligi, now there is a machlokas in our Mishnah. V'kamer Rabbi Yehuda tfos lashon rishon, and Rabbi Yehuda is saying that we follow the first phrase. And the point here, the assumption here is Rabbi Meir de Tzmura, Rabbi Meir Meseches Tzmura b'shitas Rabbi Yehuda de Masnisin Kai. He is essentially following Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah. It's all the same shita. It's all the same shita of tfos lashon rishon. The amrinan b'shmaitin, because we say in our sugya, Rabbi Meir b'shitas Rabbi Yehuda Amri, that Rabbi Meir is following the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and so therefore we should be able to bring a proof from our Mishnah to Rava's position. That's what Rava over here is saying. We'll bring a proof from that part of our Mishnah. And the Gemara continues, Amar Lei said back to him, Misavrit eino l'shchita el levasof. Do you think that slaughtering only really takes effect at the end of the slaughtering process? Of course, by the slaughtering process, you slaughter through 2 simonim in the neck of the animal. And so there's a question there, is it all a continuous process, or is it really a process that takes effect at the very end? So from your question, it's indicative, you're indicating in your question that eino l'shchita el levasof. That's the assumption you're making and bringing your proof from our Mishnah. But that's not true. Yeshna l'shchita mitchila v'yad. It's considered shchita from the beginning to the end. It's a continuous process with steps. U'mishnah seinu diyamar. In our Mishnah, the case is, he says, simin rishon chutz l'zmano. When he slaughters the first simin in the animal's neck, that's chutz l'zmano. And simin sheini chutz l'mekomo. And then the second simin of the animal's neck, that's chutz l'mekomo. And therefore, it really is 2 separate stages. If it's 2 separate stages, you can't bring a proof. And Rashi explains, Amar le misavrit eino l'shchita el vasof delahavi hachtarti machshavos besof shchita. Because then you could already say that he's having 2 intentions at the end of the shchita, that one moment of action. V'chad dibura, and you'll say that it's one statement. That's the whole point. You're trying to say that it's all like one statement, and still we have a machlokas in the Mishnah. Still, Rabbi Yehuda is arguing. V'afilu hachi neimer Rabbi Yehuda tvos lashon rishon, and even there Rabbi Yehuda is saying tvos lashon rishon. But that's not true. Yeshna l'shchita mitchila v'yad. The shchita goes from the beginning to the end. The wrong intention is effective at the end and the beginning. So our Mishnah might be talking where the slaughtering of the first siman is a machsheves chutz l'zmano, and then the slaughtering of the second siman is a machsheves chutz l'mekomo. Now you will have to say, according to this, that pigul can take place even if you're just doing half, just some of the matir. In other words, this machshava was not going on the whole shlita, it was going on just the first half of the shlita, and then there was a machshava on the second half of the shlita. Dahainu chad siman, one siman is a chatzi matir. Utrei diburi ninu, but the point over here is it's 2 separate statements, two separate wrong machshavas. Ve'ifka le midibura kadma, the first one creates pigul, avalachatzos, but when you're saying, the case that we asked the question about, we're expressly saying you're splitting the kedusha, the chad diborhu, where it's all one dibor, it's all one statement, so then modi, so then maybe he would admit that we would not say in that situation tefos lashon rishon. But the Gemara continues and asks, Hare Kamitza, but what about taking the fistful by a carbon mincha? Delechi lachatzos dami, that is also like lachatzos, it's like splitting. Upligi, and there's a machlokas tanoim over there as well between the Rabban and Rabbi Yehuda. So even though we can answer by shchita, yeshna l'shchita mitchila v'yatsof, you can't answer that by kamitza, and so therefore we still have a proof to what Rava is saying. Rashi explains, Hare Kamitza, depligi Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanan ba, Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan, they argue over there as well, in terms of tefos lashon rishon. Beparakama de menachos, this machlokas is found in the first parak of menachos. Ki mechashev lechol kazayis l'machar, kazayis b'chutz. It's the same case. When he's taking the kmitza, he has intention to eat a kazayis tomorrow, meaning again outside of the proper time, and then he has intention to eat a kazayis outside of the proper place. Delechi lachatzos dami, that's also lachatzos. Techad diburahu, that's one statement. V'zeisim harbe yesh, and there's a lot of zeisim, there's a lot of amounts that are an olive size. V'lav mahader emluchehu, that's not a case of changing his mind, it's all one statement. Here you can't say that we're talking about 2 different statements, which is the answer we gave by shchita, because you have 2 simonim. You don't have 2 simonim over here, and you can't give that answer, so we still have a proof to Rava, maybe not from the case of shchita, but from the machlokas tanoim by kamitza. And the Gemara says, no, hasam nami, over there as well, we really could have 2 stages, because it's not talking about during the taking of the fistful, rather it's talking shehiktir kometz mincha chutz l'zmano, he burned the kometz of a carbon mincha outside with the intention of outside of the proper time, and then kometz levona, and then there's also the kometz of the levona, the frankincense, chutz l'makomo, that's outside of the proper place. So you really, in terms of the burning, you really do have 2 stages. Rashi explains, the Amar kometz mincha sheha mincha yesh lo shnei matirin. When it comes to a carbon mincha, there are 2 matirin, 2 things that are matir, that permit it. Ha kometz v'halavona, there's the fistful and also the frankincense. V'chi pligi Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanan, and the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan, lav b'kmitza pligi. They're actually not arguing about when the Kohen takes the fistful, de'ein kamitza b'levona. There is no kamitza by the levona. Ela b'haktar. It's really just by the burning pligi. They're arguing by the burning, not by the kamitza. She avoda b'chol achas v'achas. That's a separate avoda by each one. Uchegon shehigter kometz mincha. And the case would be as follows: he burns the kometz, the fistful of the mincha, menas lechol kazayis l'machar, and the condition to eat kazayis tomorrow. The kometz levona menas lechol kazayis b'chutz, and then he burns the levona and the condition to eat the kazayis b'chutz, to eat the kazayis outside of the proper place. The Islay Rabbi Yehuda mefaglin b'chatzi matir, and again, Rabbi Yehuda will hold that there is pigul by a chatzi matir, even though each one is only a half a matir. V'kevon dahainu trei diburei ninu mikamo if ifaglala, and so since it's two diburim, two different statements, two different machshavas, so then we do say again that it becomes pigul from the first one. Aval b'kamitza dechad matir, or by kamitza, which is just one matir, lo polig Rabbi Yehuda would not argue. And we will note that the Shinuye Nuschos brings that some don't have the girsa of Kometz Levona, but rather the girsa of Koret Levona. But the Gemara continues and asks, Hare Kometz de Minchas Chote, what about the Kometz of the Mincha that's brought by the sinner? The Leka Levona Bahadei, that carbon Mincha happens to be, it doesn't have a Levona, so you can't give that answer. Upligi, and they argue over there as well, so we still have a proof to Rava. And the Gemara says it's not true. Lo Pligi, they don't argue in that situation, and so therefore you don't have a proof to Rava from that case. And Rashi explains, Minchas Chote, the Mincha of the sinner, that refers to specifically Mitame Mikdash, one who is Mitame, the Beis HaMikdash, or Shmias HaKol, or you have a case of Shmias HaKol, that's when the person is called to testify, and he takes an oath, he doesn't know testimony, it's a false oath. So maybe Mincha Bedali Dalis, in those situations, you bring a carbon Mincha if you're very poor, you can't afford a more expensive carbon, you bring a Mincha. Techsiv Lo Yitan Ola Levona, and about that carbon Mincha, it says that you don't put Levona on that carbon Mincha. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ravashi. Ravashi says, Im Tim Solomar Pligi, even if you say that they do argue by the Minchas Chote as well, we can still answer that it's not necessarily a proof to Rava, because Pligi b'psios, they're arguing by psios, which are the steps that are taken to convey the kometz. Rashi explains, Pligi b'psios, they're arguing by the steps, meaning uva machshavas holacha, we're talking here about conveying the kometz to the Mizbeach. The Yomar b'psia Rishona, that in the first step he takes, he says chutz lizmano, he says a machshav, an intention outside of the proper time, uvipsiya shniya, and then in the second step, amar chutz l'makomo, he says chutz l'makomo, to have a lahu trade diburi, that also would count as two separate diburs, two separate statements. And the Gemara continues, Rav Shimi Barashi Masni Kida Abaya. Rav Shimi Barashi, he taught a brisa in line with Abaya's understanding. Rav Huna Bar Nosson Masni Kida Rava. And Rav Huna Bar Nosson, he taught a brisa in line with Rava's understanding. Rashi explains, Masni Kida Abaya, Tani Masnaisa Kida Abaya. He taught a brisa like Abaya, the Velachsos Modi Rabbi Meir. Again, that Abaya said that in the case of Lachsos, where he says specifically to split, there Rabbi Meir would admit in that case that we don't say Tefos Lashon Rishon. And then Masni Kidrava, the other one teaches the brisa like Rava, Tani Masnaisa Kidrava, he taught a brisa like Rava, the Velachsos Nami Polig Rabbi Meir, that even by Lachsos, Rabbi Meir would argue and say Tefos Lashon Rishon. And the Gemara continues, Kiyasar Rav Dimi Amar, when Rav Dimi came, he said, Rabbi Meir Beshitas Rabbi Yehuda Amra, the Amar Tefos Lashon Rishon, that Rabbi Meir is following the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda, who in general says again, Tefos Lashon Rishon, that we follow the first part of the statement. That's Rabbi Meir in Tamura is following Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah. The Tanan, as we learned in our Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Zaklal, this is the rule, in Machsheves Hazman Kidmas Machsheves Hamakom, if the wrong intention in terms of time preceded the wrong intention in terms of place, Pigul v'chayav olav kares, it's Pigul and the person is liable to kares, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Lamed Amid Beis.